Last unit, folks. This one is an easy unit, I think, anyway. And since a lot of you have had apes, I think you're going to find it easy too. There's quite a bit here that's a review from Baby Bio, so that should help. All right, so we are looking at ecology, and the better definition, the one that you would get if you looked at a textbook for a college level ecology course, is that ecology is the study of the distribution, abundance, and interaction of organisms within their environment. So you're looking at where organisms are, how many there are, and how do they react with one another and with their environment, and how does the environment impact those interactions. And in Baby Bio, we focused a lot on hierarchies, right? And we looked at this hierarchy of ecology, where you can study ecology at various levels. There's organismal ecology, where you look at individual organisms within the environment. There's population ecology, and remember, a population is a group of organisms of the same species. Community ecology is looking at different populations. So notice as you move down this hierarchy, it includes the stuff above it and you just keep adding to it, right? So again, this definition of community, bear in mind that's different from a sociologist definition of community. Sociologist definition of community is all people, so it's all one species. A biologist would call that population, right? But a biologist calls a community different species. So to a biologist, a community might be found in your yard, right? You've got you and your family living there. You maybe have pets, you have squirrels, you have trees outside, maybe some bushes and flowers that y'all planted, some grass. All that is part of a community. When we add to that community the abiotic factors like rainfall patterns, soil type, stuff like that, that's called an ecosystem. And then the biosphere is all of the area on the planet Earth available for supporting life. And that it goes around the whole planet, but it's also from the lower levels of the atmosphere all the way down to the bottom of the ocean. So it's a vertical column as well as a column that spreads around the entire planet. All right, so this is just giving you examples of that. Sometimes textbooks will put a step between ecosystem and biome, and biosphere, and they'll add biome in, and we'll talk about biome. Biome is really just a very large ecosystem. It usually covers a latitude band on the planet, or at least part of one. All right, let's dig into population. So we're going to try in our notes at least to kind of move down this hierarchy to a certain extent. I can't guarantee the activities will follow that in class, but you get the idea. All right, so population ecology is founded on demographic studies. Demography is the study of populations over time, and you're looking at categories and statistics there. The largest I don't know if it is the largest actually, but a very large demographic study done by your U.S. government is the census, right? The U.S. Census is a demographic study. When you're looking at populations, there's a bunch of calculations you can make. One of those things for individuals is life expectancy, which is what it sounds like. How long are organisms in that population expected to survive? And then you have life tables that are created from that. You can also look at immigration and emigration. So you're looking at movement, who's coming in, who's leaving. For whole populations, you can calculate things like density, dispersion, and some of these other things. So density, there's the calculation, number of individuals divided by the area inhabited. So you'd get like number per hectare or number per square meter or something like that. Dispersion would look more like a map, and then you would have areas shaded for where you're likely to find the organisms. Age structure is a bar graph that looks at all of the ages and genders of the individuals in the population. Reproductive rate, which is evaluated as R, or it's listed as R. It's also known as the growth rate in Baby Bio. It's the number of births minus deaths over N, and this is a capital N, by the way, not lowercase n. Capital N is the population size. Survivorship curves, which we'll get into in a minute, and then there's biotic potential, which is the maximum growth possible for population under ideal conditions. And population biologists do something really weird here just to get a really outrageous estimate, like what's the maximum possible. They assume that all individuals in the population are female, which means that they can give birth, even though that's not true. And if a population was all female, there wouldn't be a whole lot of birth happening because you'd need males to make babies. But you get the idea. The idea is if you assume the entire population is female and is going to reproduce this year, that gives you an absolute maximum ceiling number that the population could hit in any given year. All right, so there's a dispersion, right? Showing you where you would find certain organisms. This is a life table, and that calculates how many are alive. Survivorship is here, right? In other words, percentage surviving, basically, at that age range. By the way, that's what that's showing you. Fecundity is their reproductive ability. How fertile are they? And then survivorship times fecundity to try to get how many, what's the possible max number of offspring you could get. Here are examples of age structure graphs. Okay, so these are these sideways bar graphs. And when you're looking at these sideways bar graphs, notice that 0 is dead in the center and it increases positively in both directions, with males over on one side and females on the other. And then down the middle, these are age brackets. Okay, on both graphs. So the first bracket is from 0 to 4 years old, right here. This is the 0 to 4. Above that, it's the 5 to 10-year-olds, and so on. Okay, that's what that's showing you. When you look at these, there are typical patterns that age structure graphs fall into. Notice this kind of pyramid shape here, showing that you have a population with a whole lot of very, very young people. But what population biologists also focus on is this from about 15 to about 50. Right in here, this is the reproductive age band right in the middle. And you're looking at, are they out reproducing themselves? Are they, in general, are you seeing more than this magical number that population biologists think of as replacement, right? So replacement means that every couple, every mating pair has 2 offspring, right? So you're leaving 2 offspring on the planet to replace you when you're gone, right? What you can see in an age structure like this one is that this is well above replacement. It looks like these reproductive ages are out reproducing themselves, so they're beyond replacement. Populations need to go through something called demographic transition when they look like this, because what happens is they're going to quickly outstrip their resources that way. Notice you have high birth rates, you also have high death rates, right? The population really, really narrows at the top. And what you want to do is transition to low birth rates and low death rates. And that's what we see here in this graph. Notice this graph is pretty much straight up and down, right? Pretty much for the most part. Now, notice what they've done is they've got the population in 2000, and then this is the 2050 projection that's laid on top of it. And again, that's what you're seeing in this other graph too. But what you're seeing in this other graph is they're starting their demographic transition, where the first thing you have to do in demographic transition is bring the death rate down. And notice more elders are predicted to survive in 2050 in these shaded areas. And then what you have to do after that, the very next stage of demographic transition, is to bring the birth rate back down. And it looks like they're going to do that too. Look at how the 2050 projection has that coming, has that kind of straightening up. So that indicates the population is going through that demographic transition. This developed country has already been through its demographic transition. And in fact, sometimes what you see with developed countries is you start to see a bottleneck down here at the bottom, which indicates actually that the population may go into decline, where the population may go below replacement. Being above replacement and below replacement are both problematic for populations for different reasons. Being above, obviously, you have issues with resources. Being below means you have problems keeping society going, keeping the economy going, because as more and more people retire, there aren't enough people to replace them. So it's hard to build bridges and roads and hospitals and keep things staffed when you have fewer people. All right, the next thing you're looking at is the survivorship curve. Survivorship curves kind of generally tell you the pattern of survival over the course of time. What you're looking at here is really a frozen moment. Right this second, how many individuals are alive, right? That's what you're seeing on the y-axis. And the ones that are alive, how old are they? So the age is here. What you see is this first graph, type 1 survivorship, you have high survivorship at low ages, young ages, right? And then at the upper ages, you see lower survivorship. You see a big dip there at older ages. This is typical of type 1 survivorship. Low infant mortality, that's what you're seeing. And this is what a lot of human survivorship looks like. So humans, for the most part, have this kind of survivorship. What you see here is a steady survivorship, where there's no high or low survivorship. The slope of this line doesn't change. You're as likely to die at old age as you are at young age. A lot of corals, I think, produce this kind of survivorship, right? And then the middle one is low survivorship at young age. So you have a high infant mortality. And then once you get past a certain point, then you survive pretty well until very, very old age. Think of a lot of like old oak trees and things like that would do this, right? They put out a bunch of seeds, but then those seeds don't all germinate, right? A lot of them die before they can germinate, or they get removed when they're very, very small. All right, so in terms of population size, when you're studying populations and their sizes, you've got to think about what can put a ceiling on how big population can grow. And the thing that does that is its carrying capacity. Okay, so carrying capacity is that ceiling, right? And the ceiling, the amount of individuals that are able to be in a population is dependent upon these limiting factors. So these are elements of an ecosystem that are in short supply, and they're going to be what's going to determine how many individuals you can have. And there are two kinds of limiting factors. So the first kind of limiting factor is the density dependent limiting factor. So these are the things that are going to get more scarce, or put limits on populations closer to carrying capacity. Okay, so as population density increases, these things are going to kick in more often. So disease is a prime example. Disease is going to limit the population because it's going to start removing individuals from the population. And obviously, the more crowded a population is, the more chance those diseases are going to spread. Lack of food, right? Lack of certain resources, running out of water, not having a drought, but actually running out of water because you're over consuming. All of that's going to be density dependent. The other kind of limiting factor is the density independent limiting factor. And these tend to be catastrophic events that drastically reduce the carrying capacity because all of a sudden, maybe you have less land available that's livable. Maybe you have the same amount of land, but there was a forest fire, and now the amount of livable land has actually decreased. The forest fire itself is catastrophic. It's the catastrophe that's going to set that limit, which is why it is density independent, because the forest fire didn't happen because it was a densely populated area. It happened just because that's where the catastrophe occurred. All right. And also, when you're looking at populations, scientists often use growth models to predict population growth. Remember that when you're dealing with models, this key factor down here, models are only as good as their weakest assumptions. Okay. So while there are some population growth models that are out there and that are relatively good, note that in reality, things kind of go a little wonky. So the exponential model shows, this one's called a J curve, and it assumes that populations grow without limit. So if you were looking at that, the red portion here, this is the J portion right here. That's the J curve. If this J curve kept going up, that would be the exponential model. And the assumption of the exponential model is that that growth is limitless, right? That populations can keep on growing. Obviously, that's not true. Obviously, that's not a model that works, right? And so scientists came up with this logistic model. And so the graph that you have here in total is the logistic model. And this one is the one that we call the S curve or the sigmoid curve. And that's because if you look at the shape, the trajectory of this total graph, the red portion and the blue portion, if you had an S and you kind of tugged on the end, you'd get this curve, right? So what scientists recognized is early on, you end up with this rapid population growth, right? Okay, so early on right here, the population is starting to grow rapidly. Then there's a critical turning point where you start to see slower growth, and then you have a period of equilibrium at the end. Because theoretically, what's happening is as the population starts to grow, it gets toward carrying capacity. And remember that carrying capacity is the ceiling. You're not supposed to get any further than the carrying capacity, right? So ideally, the population would level out at carrying capacity. Now, again, there are some assumptions built into this growth model. The first being that populations know what carrying capacity is. That's difficult to get humans who can think and calculate to agree to. Different models for calculating calculating carrying capacity take into account different factors and weight them differently. And so it's hard for humans to know what the carrying capacity is. Imagine a population of fungus knowing what its carrying capacity is, right? So usually that's not true. And it also assumes that when populations know what their carrying capacity is, that they will actually act accordingly, and that the population size will decrease as a result. They'll start to slow their reproductive rate. That doesn't happen either. In fact, if you were to graph logistic growth and you put the carrying capacity here, and I don't know why carrying capacity is abbreviated K, but it is. But what you get in reality is this rapid growth that quickly surpasses carrying capacity. Then it kind of drops down. You have density dependent factors kicking in and dropping the population. But then once it's below carrying capacity, it'll rise again and it will overshoot carrying capacity again, but not as far. And then you'll see those density dependent factors kicking in and so on. And in reality, what you get is an oscillation, an up and down above the carrying capacity until it levels off at the carrying capacity. This is the equation for change in the reproductive rate. Notice carrying capacity is a part of that. It's not an equation the College Board is going to want you to know. Okay. All right. Then you also have growth and life history. Okay. So when you're looking at life history of organisms, there are two kinds of strategies that you're looking at. There are species that are what we call R-selected strategies and species that are called K-selected strategies. And if you want to remember which is which, our old environmental science teacher, or our former environmental science teacher, APES teacher, Mr. Guncher, always told his students, think R for roaches and K for kangaroos. Okay, if that helps. The R-selected species have rapid exponential growth. They're often called opportunistic because they spread into an area quickly, reproduce, and die. Okay. The offspring tend to be mature quickly. They're small. There's a small little short window between generations. Grasses, insects like roaches, are R-selected species. You also have K-selected species, K for carrying capacity, right? These are like kangaroos. These species populations tend to stay relatively stable over time at carrying capacity, right? Which is why they're called K-selected. They produce a small number of offspring at a time. The offspring are usually large and require a lot of care. And they reproduce repeatedly throughout their lifetime, but again, they have a small number of offspring every time they do reproduce. So humans, kangaroos do this. All right, now, as far as populations are concerned, we can't ignore talking about the human population because this is by far the most impactful population on the planet right now. And I don't mean that in a good way. Obviously, I think we can all agree that we're doing some pretty nasty things to our planet right now. The human population worldwide is quickly reaching 9 billion, and it was just 3 billion 100 years ago. So if you don't know, let me let you in on a secret. That's what exponential growth looks like, right? We went around 1 billion on the planet for thousands of years. And then all of a sudden at the Industrial Revolution, boom, the population started to rise a lot. That's because there's increases in food supply and travel. So you have a year-round supply of food, of balanced food that our ancestors didn't have. You know, we grew up, our species grew up in an environment where we lived off of whatever was there in the moment. We went from hunter-gatherers to then cultivators, farmers, being able to grow things, and then importers, so that, again, you can get strawberries in January in your grocery store in Maine. Well, there's no reason for strawberries to be in a grocery store in Maine unless they're imported, right? They had to be brought in. But again, all of those things allowed for a more steady food supply year round. Reduction in disease. Obviously, antibiotics and vaccines were really, really important advances that were extremely helpful. It helped our countries become more developed, again, helped us to drop the death rate, increase the successful birth rate, which in other words, more of it decreased infant mortality, basically, which overall then made the birth rate drop, because one of the reasons for large families was you needed people to help you work the land when we were more of a farming society. But also there was a high death rate among babies and little kids. So you had a lot of kids in case one of them died, or two of them died, or three of them died, right? When you increase the infant survivorship in a population, women don't have to have as many kids to feel like they're covered with their family needs. So that helps too. Reduction in waste. So being able to deal with our sewage and keep our water clean has been really super important in keeping people healthy, right, and reducing the death rate. And expansion of habitat, better clothing, housing. It's been able to allow us to exploit more habitats, more places on Earth in which to inhabit. Okay, so all of those things have contributed to a large human population. Okay, so these are the milestones here. In 1420, the human population was 375 million in the world. By 1999, and notice 1720, 300 years later, it's larger, 750, 1800, 1,000, 100 millions, and so on and so on and so on. That's a billion. And then you get to 6 billion by 1999. And so on. So, you're looking at huge population growth here. And this graph is a little bit old, but the current trajectory as of around 2008 was looking at this, where by 2050, it was expected that the world's population would be at around 12 billion, which, if you're thinking of carrying capacity, that would be really, 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 really bad, right? We don't have the resources for that. It actually looks like we're starting to slow our population growth. Okay, so we're experiencing some changes that are pulling this graph down, which overall is a good thing. And there's a lot of things going on. It's a very complicated social as well as biological problem. So we could talk for hours and hours about it, but essentially slowing population growth kind of raises all ships, right? And also raising all ships slows population growth. So when you can improve people's status, give them economic opportunities, things like that, they don't feel like they have to have kids to get those things, right? And so it lowers the birth rate a little bit when there is good medicine, good vaccination programs, availability of antibiotics and things like that. It reduces the death rate. And those things are helping to control population growth all over.